Hello, Walter McKone here. Just wanted to go through what I think was A.T. Still's method. Now, what was interesting about Still was people complained, especially McConnell, complained that Still always spoke in metaphors. And of course, the use of metaphor in those days was to not drag everything out of context, slightly poetic in a way. And this was his theory, because he had no theory. And this left everybody in a quandary because all the academics that came from all these top universities wanted to learn osteopathy. So I've chosen a few books to read out certain quotes, and I'll just discuss them as we go through. The first one is Hildreth's book, The Lengthening Shadow of A.T. Still. They said here about a boy who'd essentially cut his knee off with an adze, which is like an axe, which blacksmiths use. And this particular evening, or whatever, Dr. Still turned up. Dr. Still unexpectedly returned to town that evening, and even before hearing of the case while out in the east end of Kirksville, where the boy's people lived, he called upon them and was surprised to learn of the son's condition. The mother, describing this visit to Dr. Charlie, said that he went into the room, looked at the boy, and examined his knee for a few minutes. Then he sat down in a chair by the side of the bed, put his feet up on another chair, and pulled his hat down over his eyes. He sat there so long in contemplation that the family became alarmed, and they were afraid he was going to not do anything. Evidently, having satisfied himself as to procedure, he arose and went to work. He manipulated the thigh and the pelvic bone on that side, gently rotating the thigh and stretching the limb a little, thus causing relaxation of the contracted and inflamed tissues around the knee, which is interesting. Then he went away. So by morning the swelling had materially decreased, and by afternoon, when the doctors who had advised amputation came back, they found that there was absolutely no necessity for an operation. So what's interesting here is this thing about putting his feet up on the chair and putting his hat over his head. This is deepening the experience, not just through visualization. We've done many experiments on this, on the lectures I give. And if you look at something, close your eyes, run over it again, and then look again, you see more deeply. You don't see deeper into what you're looking at. It becomes more sensitive in yourself. What's also significant, if I can find the right page, was how people really misunderstood what Still was doing. Even Hildreth, his closest student. It seems to me that my failure to understand in every instance the connection between the lesion, which was claimed by him to be the causative factor, and the disease condition, is due to the fact that Dr. Still was a much better student of natural law than I am. So understanding nature was the key issue. My hope is that the student of osteopathy today who studies and masters his anatomy, physiology, and other kindred fundamental sciences will be better able than I, to fathom the relationship between the various nerve origins and centres as given by Dr. Still and the functions they involve. Unfortunately, I think that in this particular case, Hildreth has gone the wrong way. It's not about learning more about anatomy and physiology, it's understanding that this is a deepening of personal experience. And this is what tends to happen. People want to know more and more in detail. So let's see what Still said in his own words. Let's try and find that. Okay, so this is what Still said. This is what he said when he's examining a patient. I am seeing first the bony framework and the joints which hold it together as one system, the foundation upon which all other structures in the human body are built. That first couple of words, I am seeing. So back into this idea of the mind's eye. So he's seeing it, not visually seeing. He says again, I am seeing, especially the positions of the bony parts and their relationships one with the other. I am seeing again. So this whole thing about bony relationships, don't forget, in one of the videos I put up before, we were talking about the fact that the form of the bone dictates the function of the phenomenon, or the creature, or the animal, or the patient. It's that essence through form. The bone is the deepest and slowest movement because of anatomical relationships and evolution. This is why evolution is just an important subject, which I'll be teaching next March in Holland for Panteria. Anyway, so I am seeing. So he's visualizing this again, this whole visualization process. And again he says, then I see the ligaments which hold the framework together, connecting and covering the bones at their joints from the toes and fingers to the base of the brain, marvellous creations of strength that make firm the bony structure. Okay? He says again, then I see the muscles inserting in various ways all over the bony framework, some of them covering the ligaments and others beginning and ending there. So again, seeing, seeing, seeing. Let's do one more. He says again, I am also seeing in my mind's eye. Okay, in my mind's eye. Not palpating, seeing. Not listening, seeing. I'm also seeing in my mind's eye the nervous system, the system which acts in the same capacity in the human body that the telegraph system acts in the commercial world for the interchange of thought. So it's all about seeing. Now, mind's eye is the key issue here. So let's have a look at another book. This is a book by Agnes Arber, which I highly recommend. It's called The Mind and the Eye. Okay, now, it says here, if I can find the right bit. Okay, there we go. That we see through the eyes rather than with them, okay, is a point upon which Plato seems to have had little doubt, for he makes Socrates and Theaetetus agree that it is so. So, Theaetetus, this is where we get the word theory from, which means to see or behold, and this is where we derive the word theatre, which means to see. The same idea is traceable in medieval literature. The philosopher mystic Meister Eckhart said, subtract the mind, and the eye is open to no purpose, which before did see. And again, before my eye can see the painting on the wall, this must be born into my fantasy, to be assimilated in my understanding. Now this word fantasy, it says here, fantasy is spelt with a PH. And the word fantasy again means to see, or it's sensorial perception, sensorial understanding. So the same happens with your hands as happens with your eyes. You don't see with your eyes, you see through your eyes. You don't palpate with your you palpate with your hands, not at the end of your hands. So we need to change our direction of consciousness. Now, I'm going to take a phrase here from a bit from Henry Bortoff's Taking Appearance Seriously. And he says here, he talks about Aristotle at this point, because Aristotle didn't really agree with Plato a lot of stuff, a lot of things, about the idea of actualization and potentiality. So we're always potentially treating a patient until we actualize it, until we actually do it. And he talks an example of building, okay, a building, we're using bricks. So in the activity of building, for example, when the buildable is actualized, he says it is being built. So the actualization is the building of the building. And this is the process of building. So on this account, the actual house that is built is not the actualization of the potential as such, although this is how we would think of it today. Once the house is built, there is no longer an actualizing of the potentiality as such, because there is now no potential to be actualized. Aristotle's thinking is always dynamic, as we're still thinking, is always dynamic. So what we really have to do here is change the direction of our thinking so we can see in a different way. And lastly, I think I have it here. This is from Goethe's Scientific Consciousness, again, by Henry Bortoff. But before entering into the details of Goethe's Scientific Consciousness, a more everyday example of what is meant by a transition from an analytical to a holistic mode of consciousness may be useful. When this idea is first introduced, it is often understood in a rather static way, which is itself a characteristic of the analytical mode of consciousness. Thus, lacking the necessary experience, and this word experience comes up again and again, or perhaps just not having noticed it, we try to imagine elements which are experienced simultaneously as if they are present together in a static way. Now, think of anatomy that way. If we think of anatomy in static way, this is the analytical mode of consciousness. So if we think of the dura, or a muscle or a bone connected to something else, this is a linear, static way of thinking. Right, where were we? Thinking static way, as in a snapshot of a changing scene. In fact, the experience of simultaneity and relationship in the holistic mode of consciousness is the opposite of this. inasmuch as it is inherently dynamical. So in the other book, he was saying that Aristotle always thinks and talks in a dynamic way. So we don't want balance. Balance is death. Balance just stops. We want it in a dynamic phenomenon. Whereas we imagine movement and change analytically as if the process really consisted of a linear sequence of instantaneously stationary states, like a sequence of snapshots. When movement and change is experienced holistically, it is experienced dynamically as one whole. The elements which are experienced simultaneously in this mode are thus dynamically related to each other, and this dynamical simultaneity replaces the static simultaneity of the analytical mode of thinking. So, to palpate or to see in a more dynamic mode of thinking, we have to consciously back up a little bit. So I'm not feeling in the patient, I'm allowing myself to experience everything in context all at once. It's a bit like, Henry David Thoreau had a good way of doing this. If I'm looking at something, I don't look or palpate directly at it. It's as if I want to have my thinking and my seeing just slightly there. I'm still looking, I can still see everything, but I've backed off a little bit. I'm not staring straight at it. I think it's Henry David Thoreau said something along the lines of, if you look at nature directly in the eye, it's like looking at the head of Medusa. It turns the scientist into stone. So, to recap, when we're palpating or when we're looking at something, don't look at it directly. Just come slightly offline. And that way you'll be in context with everything else. Feel it with your whole body. Don't feel it with your hands. Look with your whole body. Don't look just with your eyes. Right, hope that was helpful. Before I go, Ireland in November, that's 11th and 12th, just got it written down here. And don't forget, please subscribe so you'll get the you get alerts of my videos coming up immediately. And remember, have a look down the bottom. I think all the details will be there. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all the contacts. Right, well, I hope that was helpful.